Again, welcome. My name is Dr. Carlos Perez. We have the pleasure of having a presentation with Dr. Akshay Nadai. How did I do? And
Excellent.
also Naomi Green. Naomi, you want to introduce yourself and then introduce our speaker?
Hi everyone. I'm Naomi Green. I'm a first year clinical psychology PsyD student at Nova. And today I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Akshay Narayan, who has made outstanding contributions to understanding that bridge between neuropharmacology and therapeutic avenues for neurodegenerative diseases. Dr. Narayan received his PhD from Florida Atlantic University and Max Planck Florida Institute for Neuroscience, and completed his postdoctoral fellowship at Karolinska Institute in Sweden. At NSU, he serves as an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience in our College of Psychology, where he furthers his work into understanding herbicide neuromodulation and novel therapeutic avenues for neurodegenerative diseases. So we're truly fortunate to have Dr. Narayan with us today to share some of his insights on finding that bridge between neuropharmacology and behavior. So Dr. Narayan, it's a pleasure to have you. I'll kind of let you go ahead and take it away for us. Are we ready to get started?
Thank you, Naomi.
Great. Thank you so much, Naomi, and Carlos as well for the very kind introduction. Good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are in the world. Please let us know in the chat where you're tuning in from. We love to see that. And if you have any questions over the course of the talk, I would love to see them there, and I'll definitely be interacting with you. Very, very fortunate to be with you all today. There's going to be no PowerPoint. Carlos said you're doing sort of a fireside chat. I like that a lot. My journey in pharmacology is one that I like to share at a very human level, because I'm very, very passionate about it. So we'll sort of just start with where I got interested in this sort of work and how I got interested and ingrained in it. Is that pharmacology for me started really understanding that in my undergrad when I started working with medicinal chemists in drug development. And that's how I started into this field at all. Doing the hard work of organic synthesis and going through and figuring out how all this worked, I had a really good mentor who, you see what pharmacophores, we call them individual pieces of the drugs that are prescribed. Which ones are typically more biologically active? Medicinal chemists understand this to a really great extent, and they see the molecules in three-dimensional space. They're not flat on a piece of paper. They move, they have movement. And my mentor was so insistent on knowing the chemistry really, really well that I feel like everyone in his group was forced to understand that and get a grasp of that really, really well. And by seeing that and seeing the molecules in three-dimensional space and building that skill, which took, time and effort to do, I developed an interest for drug design. And that led me to taking on a chemistry minor. And then I started to get into neuroscience and understanding how the brain perceives chemicals, the chemicals that are naturally there, which we call neurotransmitters, and then the drugs that we might take to prevent neurodegenerative disease, assist with mental health disorders, whatever they are. Coffee to stay awake, right? Coffee to stay awake. We all have those things that we prescribe to. So getting into neuroscience and understanding this, during my PhD, I worked a lot with what we call channels that are ion channels. So these channels are the vast majority of them in your brain work as ion channels. If we think of this as just a visitor comes to your door, rings the doorbell, and you answer, right? That's all an ion channel is. A neurotransmitter like glutamate coming in, knocking on the door, and it's the right person, the door opens, and whatever response happens in the cell. Neurons communicate through electrical signals, so everything is a charged particle moving from one side to the other. In some cases, sodium for excitatory channels, and chloride for inhibitory ones. Chloride has a minus charge, sodium has a positive charge. And that's as far as I'm ever going to go into the electrical aspect of this, because it builds on itself. Studying how those channels work, right, in not just singularity, but in concert with each other, right? You're not just listening to one instrument play, you're listening to the whole orchestra. That is really, really profound, because it's such a small change happening on a cellular level, and yet it can impact our behavior, our mood, our drives, our mental health. So many different aspects can be just from this simple landscape. We move and we have all of these different manifestations out of there. For me in my PhD, I focused on looking at glyphosate, which is Roundup, is the is the street name for it, right? The herbicide that many people use. And going through very early on in my work, I realized that there wasn't that much published on the potential neurological impacts of a herbicide such as Roundup. So I wanted to pursue understanding that in the model organism that we had, and that's where I really understood these ion channels. We call them ligand-gated ion channels, but again, it's just as simple as opening that door. I found that the particular door that Roundup and glyphosate seemed to be affecting most profoundly was a door that, if it goes wrong in particular places on a global level, it can lead to depression. There's significant evidence that it leads to depression and depression-like symptoms. We call it the GABA A receptor, right? I'll give a few names, but these names are significant to scientists and not necessarily everybody else, right? The GABA A receptor for glyphosate and Roundup seem to have very, very significant blocking of the GABA A receptor. And we published that paper, and it was quite profound, because it was at that it still is the first and only neurological mechanism ever proposed for glyphosate. And since then, some great researchers over in Italy, independently on their own, replicated this mechanism in rats. I use C. elegans in my work, invertebrates, and this was replicated in now a mammalian model at a very high level. So this was very informative for me, going through the experience of trying to understand how this worked and how this channel opens and how that works in a little invertebrate worm, but how similar that is in so many ways to how that works in a human or any animal. This sort of comparative nature that the model organisms can have to each other is really interesting and really profound and really necessary to do pharmacological research. I really enjoyed that. I really did. But when I went to Sweden to do my postdoctoral work, I was able to step into a field that I didn't realize how much it would blow my mind until it did. As I said, these ion channels are like someone knocking at the door, ringing the doorbell, and then you just opening it and letting the guests in. When I went to Sweden and worked with a Parkinson's research lab, and looking at Parkinson's intervention, as you might know, Parkinson's uniquely affects dopamine. Dopamine, a major neurotransmitter in the brain, but it primarily affects dopamine signaling in the brain and impairs that. Dopamine signaling doesn't work as simply as you knock on the door and someone opens it. Dopamine's a bit more bougie than that, right? Dopamine and serotonin, right? Others, but we'll stick with dopamine and serotonin for now, have butlers that answer the door for them. They have butlers that come in and answer the door for them. These butlers are known in neuroscience and in biology as G proteins. We know them as G protein coupled receptors. We'll stick with butlers. We'll stick with the butler analogy. Now, as you can imagine, a butler could simply let the guest in just as normal, just as you would. Or they could take a message. Or they could guide you to a different part. Or they can make a sandwich for you. Or they could do any number of things. It's much, much more complex what the reaction is. You're not just simply letting someone in or not. There are so many different manifestations of what that response now is when you put that butler role there. That's what G proteins are. And that's what G protein coupled receptors are. They're the butler of neurons. They're there to react and have particular jobs to do when they get a message that there's a signal coming in. And that's what dopamine receptors do. When they receive a signal from dopamine, that's what they do. And that's why Parkinson's disease can manifest in so many different ways. There's dementia aspects of it. There's motor aspects of it. There's depressive manifestations of it. So many different manifestations of one disease that we just overarchingly call Parkinson's disease. This is a large reason why the function that happens at that level is very, very, very complex and happens in many areas of the brain. Going to Sweden and getting my first high-level, very complex look at these butlers and how they work and trying to understand and be predictive of what they might need to function and how they function was an eye-opening experience for me. Because now it's not just how do I let these guests in? How do I understand how these signals work? And that's what I spent moving from drug design and studying how neurotransmitters look and all the little different chemical pieces of a neurotransmitter and how that might fit into a receptor. I'm now looking at the receptor, these very complex series of tubes, huge, they dwarf the neurotransmitters. Taking a look at how the individual pieces of these might work and how to work with them was a totally new task, and took that skill I developed for looking at things in a three-dimensional space and tested it to the nth degree. Because if you're able to work with these receptors, that is an avenue for developing gene therapies for Parkinson's disease, for instance. So understanding how these receptors work and how they function is essential for developing new Parkinson's interventions. Because up to now, with Parkinson's disease especially, the still go-to treatment is L-DOPA, right? Which is a precursor to dopamine. So you're just helping the person produce dopamine, but that only works for a certain amount of time. And that can vary from patient to patient. But the real pressing need is that we need inventive new interventions for Parkinson's disease and work with people at a deeper level. And that's where my interests are. Currently, the receptors, all the receptors, whether serotonin or dopamine, they all have names. And I like to think of these names as, they almost sound like the character names out of Star Wars, right? There's R2-D2 in Star Wars. There's D2R for the dopamine receptor, or 5-HT1A. That's a serotonin receptor, not C3PO, 5-HT1A. I'm a big nerd, so you're going to get some of these sort of analogies from me. That's all they are. They're just names for serotonin and dopamine receptors. But studying them and understanding how they work, for instance, the D1 receptor for dopamine and the D2 receptor for dopamine both need dopamine signals, but they have totally opposite functions. They tell the cell to do totally opposite things. One neurotransmitter, totally different results. And that has an impact on that butler we were talking about before. Those G proteins have a huge impact, a huge role in that. So when I started my work in Sweden, it was understanding how that receptor how it works. Right now, the drug intervention, you might ask yourself, well, why don't we just make a drug that goes to that dopamine receptor and make that work? It's been tried. Still is, it's a drug on the market called Ropinirole. It targets the D2 receptor for Parkinson's patients. But if you ask any Parkinson's patient that has been on Ropinirole, then they have a name, a sort of moniker for Ropinirole, and they call it a divorce drug. Because as much as dopamine affects Parkinson's patients with a lot of motor symptoms, and as I said, if you activate and take a drug, the dopamine isn't just going to that one pathway or those few pathways that need support. They go to all the other areas of the brain that D2 receptors are, and that's quite a few. Particularly, they're in regions of the brain that help you modulate impulsive behavior and addiction behavior. So people on Ropinirole engage in promiscuous activity, gambling habits, a lot of things, because their impulse control is lowered due to the drug. That's not a small side effect. That's a very significant side effect for patients, because many patients who go through it, they feel like they're going crazy. They've never had a gambling issue or whatever the issue might be, and all of a sudden they can't get these thoughts out of their mind that they want to go blow $500 on the roulette table. And a lot of them also older patients, so they have a lot of life experience. I'd never gambled a day in my life, or I've never done this before, and all of a sudden I have this impulse to just throw my money away. And that is a very, very real and significant challenge for patients to go through. On the drug development and the drug designs side of things, we don't have a great way yet to target selectively drug release to only certain parts of the brain. We're working on it, but there's no great way yet. And we also see a similar thing with SSRIs and SNRIs, which are the antidepressant drugs. They just don't tackle serotonin in the centers where someone struggling with depression or depression symptoms might be experiencing issues. They go to all the serotonin areas of the brain. They just don't selectively go to a particular part. They affect the whole brain. And while this is helpful to some people, it also comes with its own litany of side effects. And that's where we meet this bridge, right, of having interventions that work to a certain degree for some people. But we also, as researchers, it's very important to me that we also keep a very sober perspective that we need to be doing better. We need to be doing better for patients who are going through, whether it's a mental health disorder or a neurological disorder like Parkinson's disease. We need to provide better. And that's what spurred me on to really understand how these receptors work, what makes them tick. Because if you can understand the secrets of the receptors, maybe that lends to unique insights. The work from Sweden is unfortunately not published yet, so I can't get too far into the details on it without really making my postdoctoral mentor upset. But what I will say is the value of learning and looking at receptors. So far, I think there have been 3 Nobel Prizes given out for G protein coupled receptors, different aspects of it. Just recently, I think beginning of this year, a researcher at University of North Carolina, UNC Chapel Hill, Brian Roth, he is one of the world-renowned experts in these G protein, these butlers, and their pharmacology, how they work. G proteins work, these butlers work to help you even taste, not just what's happening here, but your sensation of taste. He was looking at a receptor that helped with bitter taste. And as I said, it's always been ring the doorbell, and then either a butler or the door just opens or the butler comes. These are the 2 aspects that we understand. Just earlier this year, Brian Roth and his group at UNC Chapel Hill uncovered a totally new mechanism for how these butlers work. And it's really James Bondy. How this works is that cholesterol, normal macromolecule that's just hanging around all your cells, binds to the receptor. Not a neurotransmitter, not anything else. Cholesterol is going to come and bind. That changes the shape of the receptor, and a secret pocket and compartment opens for the taste chemical to bind to, and that activates the butler. Let me just say, there has been nothing like that ever described before. In the whole history of everything, there has never been that kind of mechanism described before. And that was a few months ago. And that begs the bigger question, are there other receptors that might be impacted by that same mechanism? I see someone in the chat has asked me to say that one more time. Happy to do so. This is a receptor that helps you sense bitter taste. Instead of a neurotransmitter or a taste chemical binding directly to the receptor as is normal, cholesterol is going to bind to the actual receptor. Normal macromolecule that's hanging around. That changes the shape of that receptor designed to help you perceive bitter taste. And inside the cell, that shape change exposes a secret compartment, a secret pocket that no one ever saw before. That secret pocket opened up, and that's where the taste chemical is going to sit and bind and call the butler over and activate that G protein to come over. If the taste chemical doesn't bind to the secret pocket, the butler's not moving. It has to have both cholesterol to reveal the secret pocket, and then the taste chemical binds to the secret pocket. It's like buying a desk off eBay and then all of a sudden finding, a secret panel underneath. So someone's asked, is that bitter taste being blocked or increased? That's the sensation of bitter taste. That is to generate bitter taste to your brain. So that's not blocking a signal, it's providing the signal. That's how you sense bitter taste, is by this mechanism. And as I said, this is the first time in all of pharmacology, any mechanism, any secret compartment like this has ever been described for a receptor. And that was a few months ago after we've handed out, 3 Nobel Prizes on the topic, which is no small feat for those scientists. We have so much more to learn. And I think understanding the pharmacology at this cellular level helps us, really provides us a basis to understand the complexity of emotion and emotional landscape. As someone has asked, does that mean cholesterol is a basic element for the brain? Yes, right? I know that, colloquially, we think of cholesterol as bad, right? You have high cholesterol, right? That's cardiovascular, it has that negative connotation to it. But cholesterol is very, very necessary macromolecule in your cells in general, not just your brain as well, but very, very important for your cellular function in general, right? So there's this balance of that. But understanding these butlers and how they work to serve the brain and how it looks to communicate different aspects of the brain. This is why addressing mental health in particular and neurological health can be such a challenge. And really great by working here at NSU, we have a great psychology faculty who are really great at describing these things on a behavioral level. And that's inspiring me to really look at things at the cellular level, at the pharmacological level, and try to understand these changes better and better and better. Because that is where the secret sauce is understanding these butlers and how they work and how they function. Because if you take, this is just one butler we're talking about, for instance, right? You have billions of them in your brain, going to every part of your brain. We call them diffuse modulatory systems in the brain, but essentially they arise from a singular place or a few select places in the brain, and they go everywhere. They just go widespread. And that's the real challenge of trying to understand we understand there's a difference between happiness and joy. One is more extreme, joy is more extreme than just happy. I'm happy, I'm joyful, right? How does that manifest in the brain? How do we understand the valence of that on a neurobiological level, right? How do we start to understand how these butlers and ion channels and all of these work together to answer questions like that? By pursuing these sorts of research questions, we're able to gain valuable insight to help mental health disorders and neurological disorders. And for me, I'm very passionate about both. I have eggs in both baskets, as they would say. For me, I'm very, very passionate about the Parkinson's side of things because of my exposure to it, and the mental health and depression side. We see that young people are really suffering with their mental health, and trying to understand what might be triggering it, what might be making it worse, right? And oh my goodness, you want to hear something that really takes advantage of the complexity of these butlers is the social media aspect of things. When we say that social media, it's quite well published and quite mainstream, that social media going in gives you the hit of dopamine in your brain, right? Seeing a like or a click or a comment or whatever it is gives you that dopamine hit. But what I think I would want to share with you is that the dopamine release is not a simple process. That's not affecting one or a couple parts of your brain. That's affecting a huge part of your brain that is designed to help you deal with impulsive behaviors. That's why people it's instinct to just, every few minutes, you're just looking at the phone. right? Just check. What are you checking? You didn't feel a notification. You didn't feel the vibration, didn't hear a notification, nothing. Why are you doing this? Right? It's just impulse. Just impulse. The brain goes on a default mode and now has this connection with um with the device and with this digital landscape. Again, yes, for me, I'm talking about cellular butlers, but when you increase it and you blow it up to its largest extent, the basis for um, emotional contagion, which is the phenomenon where by seeing someone and seeing their mood, and especially if you're connected with them, seeing their mood, your mood is affected, right? And you have this aspect of mimicry. And that aspect is really, 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 it's really substantial. The first papers, I think, were in 2011, really defining this. And that at its cellular level starts with these butlers for dopamine and serotonin. That gap, there's a lot of unknown area in that gap. Emotional contagion, we can describe it quite well. I can describe quite well a lot of how the butlers work on a cellular level, but the gap in between them is huge. And a lot of it, a lot of it is unknown. And that's where tackling this matters. That's where tackling with this matters. Because emotional contagion is amplified many, many times fold through social media and through social media interactions. And if we really want to start to get a handle on this and give good guidance, really good, well-founded, based on evidence guidance to the next generations coming up, we have a huge responsibility to understand these things well. We have a huge responsibility to make an impact and take a good look at these things and try to understand these little pieces. And that's going to require not just a lot of work from one or a few people, integrative work between psychologists, neuroscientists, all over, the clinicians. It requires a team to come together and really, if you really want to solve those kinds of ideas, chemists, right? If you really want to solve those types of questions, you got to bring all that together, right? So I want to give a bit of time. I know I could talk about the pharmacology of things ad nauseum. I really could. But I'm really interested in what questions you might have. And I really like to make a good bit of time because I know people have their own interests on this, and I want to share whatever I know or whatever I can with you on platforms like this. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat, in the webinar format. I would really, really love to see the questions, and I'll try to attend to them as best as I can. So, okay, first question I see on here. So do you think we shouldn't be on social media because of its negative effects? Thank you for the question. That's Kirpa. Thank you very much for the question. I'm on social media, right? I think it's really tough to tell people you shouldn't be on social media. Social media is a tool. And I think an awareness and a balance of how to use this tool is important. All right. Same thing with machine learning and AI. It's a tool, a good tool. Use the tool well. And I think a huge part is imparting wisdom on how to use the platforms well, how to keep it in context. And I think social media use is not, it can be good if you have enough just social interaction, person to person social interaction. I know I'm being a bit of a hypocrite saying that over Zoom, but you know, person to person interaction is very important. And I think complements that aspect of social media very nicely. So if you're off of social media, and that's, you know, good for you, if you're on, moderate your time. Moderate your time and be careful. Be mindful of your tendencies and your use of it. That's very important. So let's see. Next question here. Let's see. Does the underdeveloped brain have less receptors for youth, for example? No. Arguably, you have more, right? The brain undergoes what we call synaptic pruning, right? And just like you prune a tree, right, or a shrubbery that you have, the brain undergoes synaptic pruning over time, and you actually have less, you know, of these receptors as you get older, right? So for young people, though, the connections, we also have another saying where synapses that fire together wire together, right? And that's how we form associations and synaptic connections with each other. So if, you know, if you're learning a new skill, the more you practice that new skill, right? If I'm learning to drive, right? If you've been driving a long time, you don't really even think about it anymore. You jump in the car, you go, and, you know, you're off you go, right? Those synapses have wired together so often that it's become second nature to you, right? Be careful of how, especially for young people, the strength of those synapses can be very strong and become strong very quickly. Be cautious of what sort of connections you're forming and how you're forming them. We're getting a lot of questions and they all look really, really good. So I apologize in advance if I don't get to your question. I'm trying to work through it as best I can. What are the best treatments for patients with impulsivity due to Parkinson's? All right. First of all, not an MD, PhD, but happy to speculate from a research perspective. I just got to say that before I get sued. So what are the best treatments for patients with impulsivity? There are none, for especially if that on ropinirole for us in particular, right? A D2 agonist for ropinirole, it's very, very difficult to manage because that's what's managing the tremors and improving the movement for the patient. So if you decrease or give anything to modulate that, you're also going to decrease the effectiveness of the drug. So this is why, like, ropinirole, you know, a little while ago was prescribed very widely, and now clinicians hesitate to prescribe it because they know the extreme nature of the side effects that can come about, and that's very, very real and very difficult for patients to manage. I know one person who was on this drug, on ropinirole, and to manage, because a lack of sleep, all of these other things they were experiencing, they decided to start a PhD program because constantly writing, and it was constantly writing and doing research was an effective use of their energy. And if they had to do anything impulsively, something productive, at least, right? It's not destroying your life. And as soon as they came off the drug, they never finished their PhD. They were like, the need for it and that impulsiveness, they realized in looking back retrospectively that was a coping mechanism for all of this energy and what they were feeling in their brain. That was an outlet for them. All right. Very nice here. Some really, really good questions. let's see, two nice questions here. Bradford, I'm curious to know whether you see recent advances in AI as having any influence on research with neurobiology. Of course, yes, huge, um, huge advances. So last year, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was given to Google DeepMind for developing what they call AlphaFold. AlphaFold is a technology for AI 3D renderings of these receptors, of these D2 receptors and these serotonin receptors, and all of them. The AI machine learning is helping us visualize things like never before. It's not perfect. It's not close to perfect, but it is an accessibility element because AlphaFold is for free. It's a free online software. The alternative is having a cryo-electron microscope, which is just as expensive as it sounds. And to run it, even more expensive. So there's an accessibility, and I feel like when we get that accessibility hammered out, you just have more researchers entering the space. So I think AI and machine learning still has a far way to go in doing this really well, but I'm quite happy. I'm quite hopeful for that future. Thank you so much for that question. Alejandra asks, are there any natural D2 supports, including herbs or nutrients that can be used as adjunct support, particularly for Parkinson's disease? Really great question. A lot of people are looking to, sort of these herbalistic alternatives and, by paying attention to their health. I would say I am not the expert in that field to give advice in that area, but please, I would encourage you to reach out to others, maybe not specifically D2 dopamine support, but maybe things that help neuroinflammation. We understand that Ozempic, right? GLP-1 agonist, right? Ozempic, that family of drugs has been found to help Parkinson's disease, because originally Ozempic wasn't used for weight loss. It was a type 2 diabetes drug. And we understand that that is decreasing levels of neuroinflammation. We don't understand exactly how that mechanism works as yet, but it's clear that there's some mechanism there that works at a really good level. And it helps, it helps those, there's a number of studies that show that it helps in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. So maybe it's not always about D2 and directly going at the question head on. Maybe neuroinflammatory routes and decreasing neuroinflammation, those are also can be very useful pathways to get there. And I think on that level, there's a number of nutritional elements that might be helpful. Let's see. Are you able to speak to the mechanism of dopamine reduction in the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, PMS symptoms in women? Does it have to do with insufficient progesterone production and reduced stimulation of alloprogesterone receptors? Tanya, wonderful question. I am unfortunately not I'm not the expert in that, and cannot, would not. But I think it's a very critical question of understanding, for instance, in instances like this, where there can be gender differences, right? It's very important to highlight that, when we talk about, for humans, we talk about all humans, right? It's very, very important that we understand that at a very broad, at a very fundamental level, that when we prescribe pharmacology, a lot of the old studies, we're doing better at it now, but we still needs a lot of improvement. A lot of them were done, the initial studies were just done in male animal model systems. We need to have that female aspect in representation, and grant agencies are being more insistent on it. I think we can do a better job still, but because there are questions like this that are extraordinarily important, Tanya. So thank you for lending that perspective. Very, very pleased to see it. Yes, how does this apply to children and young adolescents? Children and young adolescents, I mentioned it a bit earlier. The synapses that fire together, wire together. Kids make associations really, really quick. They're very fast. I see it all the time with my nephew. He's 4 years old. He makes associations really fast, right? And all kids do, right? Their brains are working overtime to figure out a world. What's dangerous, what's not, what's good, what's bad, what's this, what's that. And their brains work overtime to make these kinds of connections. It's very, very important to look at, young children and adolescents. Their pharmacology of these GPCRs it goes to an nth level compared to ours, and it's really important to understand that perspective. So thank you very, very much for your question. Let's see. Let's see. You talked about G protein coupled receptors and about emotional contagion and a gap. By gap, do you mean what we don't know? Do you mean what we don't know on how they're connected? Yes, Maria, that is what I'm referring to. We understand how the G proteins work and how they come over and how those butlers come over to the activated receptors, and we understand emotional contagion and understanding it better and better. But the gap between these two things, we know they're connected, right? But to build up that space and describe how the neurobiological mechanisms bleed into the behavior and then into the emotional contagion element, the neurobiology of somebody else, by definition of emotional contagion, that is a huge space where we need to understand more. So that's the area of what we don't know, and that's what I'm calling the gap. Very important clarification. Thank you. Let's see. Hi, Professor. Do you think the younger generations may be facing neurological and mental disease at earlier ages, since they're used to being on apps like TikTok that boost addictive and impulsive behaviors? Sol, thank you very much for your question. I think it's a factor. It's a big factor. We see that it lends itself to many social media is not just emotional, the emotional contagion element of it and so much else leads to a lot and contributes to a lot and plays a big factor in a lot of mental health disorders that we see in young people, whether it's anxiety or depression or many, many others. It is no doubt that younger generations face a more pressing need to answers to these questions than any other. And I think it'll compound. So that's why, for me, I'm very, very passionate about one, increasing awareness through great platforms like this, and two, addressing it from the research point of view and trying to understand that well. Very, very nice questions coming in. Benjamin Greenberg, could you talk about the role of psilocybin and ketamine play in treatment for depression in terms of the differences with SSRIs, MAOs, SNRs, and various neurotransmitters? Oh, great question. Okay, that's really pharmacology. So I think that the data on actually I'm just finishing up a paper trying to describe this from a clinical point of view, the role of psilocybin and ketamine. And I think based on the literature, without getting too in-depth to the pharmacology, I'd love to, Benjamin, if you want to write me an email, I'd love to get more into the pharmacology with you offline. But to answer your question, I think combination therapy is what's showing the most promise for psilocybin and ketamine right now. I know there's a great deal. Sweden's doing a very big psilocybin clinical trial right now on depression. I think there's a lot to work out there for individual, whether it's ketamine or psilocybin on its own. But I really have a feeling that based on the literature that combination therapy for psilocybin and ketamine with SSRIs or SNRIs, these are can be very, very promising for people with treatment-resistant depression. I think that can be a really marvelous way forward in that field. Very, very interested to talk to you more about it, though. So please reach out. That's a really nice question. Okie dokie. Let's see. Oh, this one on cortisol I wanted to chat on. Are there any natural cortisol supports, including adaptogens or minerals that can be used as adjunct supports, particularly for chronic fatigue and burnout? Overworked student here. Stacy, right there with you. Dealing with stress is not particularly my area, right? Stress is, there's a lot of endocrine function involved in managing the stress pathways, especially cortisol pathways. But there are supports out there, and managing the chronic fatigue and burnout is really, really important to get ahead and be in front of it. It's not something you should be like, oh, I can just push through it and overcome and deal with. Those approaches tend to make it a lot worse. So I'd really, really, really encourage you to look out there, see that's there, consult with professionals on that, and that's where you're going to get a lot of. But there is considerable support out there for those things, and also making time for yourself. All right, as a student, I had to learn to do that. It's not something I did very much in my undergrad, but I paid for it. So please make sure, all the students out there, make sure you're making time to take care of yourself. Your academics are very important. Your profession is very important. But none of that works without you. We need you to be a big part of that. And if you're not there, the rest of it is quite moot. So please do what you need to support yourself moving through this process. Great question. Okay. Could you go into depth of what happens in the brain when receptor sensitivity changes due to long-term drug exposure, such as anxiety medications? All right. So great question, Retsana. Thank you very much for the question. On a broad level, the anxiety medications are typically amphetamine derivatives, right? And a lot of them affect dopamine, the dopamine reuptake. So they leave dopamine in the circuitry for longer, right? It leaves dopamine in the synapse for longer. So if I'm talking about that class, there's many classes of anxiety medications, but if I can talk about that one, is that there are long-term sensitivity aspects to it. We're trying to understand it better, right? And the clinicians are working very, very well to try to manage things better. But working one-on-one with clinicians, especially, if someone is going through this, if you're starting to feel the side effects are too much, side effects are not something you necessarily need to push through, right? talking to your clinician and having very real conversations and making them take your conversation about side effects very seriously is important. That's how you advocate for yourself in a clinical setting. And that is extraordinarily important. Extraordinarily important. You're the one paying for treatment, right? You should be invested in making sure you're getting a good answer and you're not settling for whatever treatment they're just giving you. Long-term sensitivity to pretty much all drug treatments, especially those in the brain, are a big concern. And making sure you're having those honest conversations with your clinician about side effects is a great way to making sure you're intervening before long-term effects become too severe. Let's see. Jessica asks, working in substance use so many of the doctors I work with naysay ketamine, but I'm very curious as well as the possible benefits of for those with depression, which is often co-occurring with substance use disorders, in moderation, of course, perhaps in medically assisted treatment. Would that be counterproductive for the sensitivity issue that can be present following years of substance use? Yeah, ketamine is emerging. It has been an emerging field. It's a very hot field right now. In trying to answer questions like this, I think the medically assisted side and medically monitored side of ketamine use or psilocybin use is very important. I think, being responsible, right, in proposing pharmacological treatment is also very important. So that is, so that's very, very, very important. I think it's left to be seen what is there with ketamine from a mechanistic level, but it's showing a lot of promise. It is showing a lot of promise, but as you said, giving it to those with substance use disorder can be a slippery slope. I think if we're going to approach that from a research perspective, it's important to be careful, because if it's not, it's very easy to slap a taboo on it and it'll never get back into the mainstream again. So I think being very cautious and very prudent with how we go about those clinical trials and go about these studies is extraordinarily important. Extraordinarily important. Shalette asks, what do you think of transcranial magnetic stimulation as a treatment for psychological disorders such as the ones you previously mentioned? Transcranial magnetic stimulation is now, so deep brain stimulation, right, is surgical intervention, right, introducing a magnetic field, and that has shown actually spectacular results for Parkinson's. It's a surgical intervention, so it's quite an extreme, but it has shown really, really good promise. The transcranial magnetic stimulation is sometimes difficult to assess. But for instance, the main centers that produce dopamine and serotonin, which are most involved in mental health disorders, the centers for those are in the brain stem. They're produced there and then project to other places in the brain. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, even here or here, it's difficult to selectively stimulate that, right? It would be very, very difficult to target that directly. So I'd be interested to see how it went, but I think practically it poses some issues That's not to say it doesn't work. I've heard anecdotally and seen in some of the research some nice promise with it, but I think more work needs to be done before we can make really good heads or tails of that. All right. I'll do one last question here because we just ticked over 1 o'clock here, so I don't want to keep anyone too much longer than it has to be. In Alzheimer's patients, the ventricles in the brain seem to be enlarged in comparison to the healthy brain. How does the medication that are already created help with this? For Alzheimer's patients, they don't. They don't stop the ventricular enlargement that happens. So they help preserve some of the memory function, but I don't know of a drug on the market that prevents ventricular enlargement or helps to stop it. The neurodegenerative aspect of things is very significant. So yes, we need to take a good look at neurodegenerative disease and mental health disorders. So as I said, I missed a lot of questions here this afternoon, but I want to thank you all for putting your questions here in the chat. I've really, really enjoyed the session today, and I hope you've gained some nice insights over our time together this afternoon. So thank you so much. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Carlos. Thank you so much. It was a real joy to be with you all this afternoon.
This was truly a pleasure, and I love your approach of really just speaking what's on your mind. It's really a pleasure. It's very refreshing. I can imagine you could see all the questions coming in, and you saw that some people are asking for part two. Part two is coming in, do an additional degree perhaps, but we'll definitely have to have you back. I know you've had some interest in doing podcasts. I could see that it'd be quite natural for the information you're giving. There's so much new research out there. I can imagine it sounds like you've got your hand very much on this.
Thank you. No, it's a joy, and it's a joy to share it. So thank you so much.
Okay, I look forward to chatting more about your work in Sweden and your continued research here. Take care. Thank you.
All right, Carlos. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.